Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep into the fascinating ways our brains get things done, drawing from the insights of David Badre's book OnTask, How Our Brain Gets Things Done.
That's right.
Consider this your shortcut to understanding how you manage your daily load, navigate information overload, and experience those satisfying moments when everything clicks. Our core question: how does your brain actually manage to manage?
Well, our deep dive today aims to uncover the fundamental systems of cognitive control in your brain. We'll start with the initial puzzles surrounding the frontal lobe.
Okay.
Explore the often frustrating gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it, and then delve into the clever mechanisms your brain uses to keep you focused and on track.
Okay, let's get right into that initial brain teaser then, the frontal lobe.
Yeah.
Even way back when, a giant like William James looked at the frontal lobes
Yep.
and basically said, huh,
Right. It wasn't obvious.
stimulating them didn't seem to do much,
Mm-hmm.
and even removing parts didn't always lead to obvious problems, which is weird.
It is weird. And then you have the observation by Donald Hebb of a patient who seemed to get better after some frontal tissue was removed.
Better. Wow.
Yeah. So the early takeaway is that intelligence isn't the whole story. There's this other crucial element at play, cognitive control.
Right.
Absolutely. This early ambiguity sparked a lot of debate, obviously, but the real puzzle comes into focus when we see individuals with seemingly sharp minds and extensive knowledge who still struggle with everyday tasks.
Okay, so like knowing stuff isn't enough.
Exactly. Take the case of EVR, an accountant who, years after surgery to remove a frontal tumor, scored incredibly well on intelligence tests. We're talking 97th to 99th percentile on the ways.
Wow, that's high.
Extremely high. It broadly measures intelligence across different areas. He could discuss complex topics with real insight, yet
There's a but.
a big but.
Yeah.
He faced major hurdles managing his daily life. EVR perfectly illustrates a central insight. High IQ doesn't guarantee effective action. That bridge between knowing and doing is what we're really diving into.
So you've got someone with all this intellectual horsepower, all this information stored away, but a real challenge in turning that into effective real-world behavior.
Precisely.
It really shines a light on that critical gap between understanding what needs to be done and actually making it happen.
And what makes this gap even more intriguing is how poorly our standard cognitive control tests sometimes predict real-world performance.
Oh, really? The ones they use in clinics?
Those very ones. Studies show they only explain about 18 to 20% of why patients struggle with daily problems.
18 to 20%. That seems surprisingly low.
It is surprisingly low. That's a really weak connection when you think about it.
It is. So why this disconnect? If these tests are the tools we use to measure cognitive control, why aren't they a better indicator of how someone functions day to day?
Well, a major reason is that most lab tests are quite simple. They're structured. They don't capture the messy, open-ended situations we face when planning and carrying out actions in the real world.
Right. Real life isn't a multiple choice test.
Not at all. A really illuminating study from 1991 by Chalus and Burgess looked at patients with frontal lobe damage who actually performed quite well on standard intelligence and cognitive tests. However,
Their real lives were a different picture entirely. They showed clear difficulties with cognitive control in their everyday routines.
that's it.
There's that almost unbelievable example, isn't there? The patient who left therapy to get coffee and somehow ended up on a golf course.
That's the one. It really highlights the gulf between intention and action in complex, real-world scenarios.
Totally.
Precisely. And the study itself documented these inefficiencies. Patients struggled to complete even a few everyday tasks, often breaking self-imposed rules along the way.
Like forgetting simple things.
Yeah, like the patient who remembered to get the weather from an old newspaper but then completely forgot to pay for it. Little slips like that, but they add up.
It's like having all the right software installed in your brain, but the operating system that manages how it all runs just isn't working quite right.
That's a great analogy. And Brenda Milner's 1964 research gave us another crucial piece of this puzzle. She observed a curious dissociation.
Dissociation.
Yeah, in patients with frontal lobe damage who were performing the Wisconsin card sorting test. These individuals could often explain the rules of the test, sort the cards by color, shape, or number, but they just couldn't consistently follow those rules.
Ah, the card sorting test.
Yeah.
That's where you have to figure out the hidden rule for sorting cards, right? And then the person running the test changes the rule on you without telling you.
Exactly.
It's a classic way to test how flexible your thinking is.
It is. Most people adapt to the new rule relatively quickly. But patients with frontal lobe issues often show perseveration.
Perseveration, meaning they get stuck.
They get stuck. They keep sorting based on the old rule, even after being told they're wrong again and again.
Even when they know it's wrong.
That's what's truly fascinating. Some of these patients were actually aware of their mistakes. They could even tell you the correct possible rules. It has to be the color, the form, or the number, yet they were simply unable to use that knowledge to change their behavior.
Wow.
They knew what they should be doing, but they just couldn't make their actions match that understanding.
They had the intellectual understanding, but the brain's machinery for implementing that understanding was somehow broken down.
Yes. And it gets even more remarkable. Neurologist F. Lermit described phenomena called utilization behavior and environmental dependency syndrome.
Okay, what are those?
In these cases, patients would be compelled to perform complex, often multi-step action sequences triggered by simple environmental cues, even when those actions were completely out of sync with the broader situation.
That's where you hear those almost unbelievable stories, like the patient who saw the sheets turned down on a bed in a stranger's house
Exactly.
and just started to get undressed, despite likely knowing they were in their doctor's home and that it's socially inappropriate.
Right. The knowledge of social norms seemed to be completely overridden by the immediate environment. The visual cue of the bed just triggered this complex learned behavior
Automatically.
automatically. So we're seeing this clear separation between having knowledge and being able to use it effectively in the moment.
Right.
It's obvious there needs to be some kind of control system in the brain that acts as a bridge, taking that knowledge and guiding our actions.
It's not just about having the information.
No, it's about how that information is managed and used to steer our behavior toward our goals. Think of it like a computer system.
Okay.
You've got the hard drive with all your files, that's your knowledge. You have input and output devices and various programs that can perform operations. But to get something done, like using a spreadsheet.
You need something managing it all.
Exactly. The system needs to control the flow of data between these components at the right time and under the right conditions. These control processes aren't doing the calculations themselves. They're directing the overall process to achieve your goal.
So this idea of a control system helps us move away from that old philosophical puzzle, the homunculus problem, right?
Yes, exactly.
The notion of a tiny person inside our heads pulling all the strings and making all the decisions.
Precisely. Early attempts to explain how we control our behavior, like the TOTE model, which stands for Test Operate, Test Exit.
TOTE. Okay.
Yeah, TOTE. It proposed that we perform actions in a loop, constantly testing to see if we've reached our desired state and continuing to operate until we exit the loop.
Work a feedback mechanism.
Sort of, yeah. For example, the overall goal of eat banana can be broken down into smaller tote cycles, like chew, with its own test operate, test exit process controlling your jaw movements.
So instead of one central commander, you have these nested sets of testing and operating that guide our actions at different levels.
Exactly. The computer analogy and models like TOTE demonstrated that self-control is possible without needing a magical central decision maker.
Which is a big step.
A huge step. However, these early models didn't completely solve the homunculus problem. There was still a whiff of it.
And then you have the degrees of freedom problem, adding another layer of complexity to all this.
Oh, yes.
It's not just what we decide to do, but also how we choose to do it. There are often countless ways to achieve the same outcome.
That's right. Think about making a cup of coffee.
Huh.
Some choices are critical, like putting coffee grounds in the filter before you turn on the water.
Definitely critical.
Right. While others, like whether you get the milk from the fridge before or after you grab a mug, probably don't matter as much.
It does make much difference.
Probably not. Yet your brain still needs to select one specific sequence of actions from all the possibilities. It's like having 1,000 ingredients in your kitchen. Cognitive control is the chef deciding which ingredients to use and in what order to make a specific dish.
So a complete understanding of cognitive control needs to explain not only why we sometimes fail to act on what we know, but also how our brains select specific plans and actions when there are so many options available to us.
Exactly. And to get a sense of how this complex control system might have developed, we can look back at our early human ancestors.
Okay, the evolutionary angle.
Yeah. Evidence suggests that Homo heidelbergensis, around 500,000 years ago, was capable of multitasking while crafting stone axes.
Multitasking. 500,000 years ago.
Apparently so. Maybe refining one part while keeping the overall shape in mind. This implies a level of foresight and the ability to juggle multiple goals at the same time. That suggests a certain level of cognitive orchestration.
That's fascinating, keeping one goal in mind while actively working towards another. It points to a more sophisticated level of mental management.
It does. However, when we look at the archaeological record, we have to be careful about drawing too many conclusions about cognitive control just from tools.
Right, complexity doesn't always equal complex thought.
Precisely. Just because we find a complex tool doesn't automatically mean it required advanced cognitive control to create. Think of a spider's web, incredibly intricate and effective, yet it's built without, well, a highly developed prefrontal cortex.
That's a good point. The complexity of the output doesn't necessarily reflect the complexity of the brain power behind it.
What becomes more informative, perhaps, is the ability to take something you've learned in one situation and apply it effectively in a new context. Psychologists call this transfer.
Transfer, okay.
Positive transfer is when prior learning helps you in a new situation. Imagine going from playing breakout to Pong. The skill of moving the paddle transfers nicely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But if you mistakenly tried to apply the goal of breakout, destroying all the blocks, to Pong, well, that would be negative transfer. You'd lose.
Right, so it's about knowing which parts of what you've learned are relevant and how to apply them appropriately in a novel situation.
Exactly. It suggests that our action system is built up from smaller, reusable components. It's compositional.
Compositional, like building blocks.
Kind of, and our memories aren't just a collection of isolated events. They're organized into interconnected networks of knowledge called schemas.
Schemas,
Right.
like mental framework.
Exactly. These schemas go beyond specific memories, allowing us to make inferences and predictions. Key brain regions involved here are the hippocampus and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC.
VMPFC.
Think of the VMPFC as helping you access and use your general knowledge about how the world works. Damage to the VMPFC can disrupt these schemas, leading to problems like confabulation.
Confabulation.
Those strange but sincerely held false memories.
Like someone insisting they can't find parking even though they don't own a car. Or complaining about a broken arm that isn't actually injured.
Exactly, those kinds of things. It's as if their internal model of reality has become distorted because the schema isn't working right.
Wow.
And this capacity to build and use schemas is closely linked to our ability to imagine the future, what we call episodic future thought.
Thinking ahead.
Yes. Both rely on similar brain systems, including the hippocampus and the VMPFC. People with amnesia who have damage to these areas and struggle to remember the past in detail, they also tend to imagine future events with much less richness and vividness. Similarly, individuals with confabulation disorders often have difficulty planning their personal futures.
So remembering the past and imagining the future are linked.
Very closely linked. It suggests a common underlying mechanism for mentally navigating time.
So while other animals show foresight in specific instinctual ways, like a squirrel burying nuts,
Right, very domain-specific often.
human future thinking seems to be broader, more flexible, and tied to our ability to remember and reconstruct past experiences.
Exactly. This argues against the idea that sophisticated cognitive control suddenly emerged in humans relatively recently, say around 60,000 years ago.
Which some people used to think.
Yeah, the cognitive revolution idea. But the evidence of multitasking in Homo heidelbergensis much earlier, and the gradual increase in complexity of Acheulean axe construction over hundreds of thousands of years.
That points to something more gradual.
It points to a more gradual and progressive development of these abilities. It wasn't like flipping a switch.
It suggests a kind of back and forth evolution, maybe, between our ability to think about more complex futures and our ability to control our actions in increasingly intricate ways to achieve those imagined outcomes.
That's a really nice way to put it, a co-evolution. As our capacity for episodic thought expanded, allowing us to conceive of more distant and complex goals, this in turn would have driven the development of our cognitive control systems to organize those thoughts into effective action plans,
So one system boosts the other.
potentially leading to an accelerating, seemingly stepwise increase in our overall abilities over evolutionary time.
And what kind of physical changes in the brain might have accompanied this evolution of cognitive control? We always hear about brain size.
Well, across different species, we generally see that increased cognitive control and intelligence are associated with a larger brain size relative to body size, and particularly a larger neocortex, that outer wrinkly part of the brain responsible for higher-level functions,
Our big brains.
or big brains. And in primates, the prefrontal cortex, which is crucial for cognitive control, shows an interesting evolutionary trend. Older, more posterior parts of the prefrontal cortex have broad connections across the brain,
Okay.
while newer, more anterior regions have more restricted connections primarily within the frontal lobe itself,
More specialized.
possibly suggesting a hierarchical organization that would be very useful for managing complex control.
So the expansion of the human brain, especially the prefrontal cortex and its intricate network of connections, likely provides the hardware for this hierarchical cognitive control needed to manage multiple goals at different levels of abstraction and across longer timescales.
That's the general idea, yes. However, the evolutionary pressures shaping cognitive control weren't solely about finding food and energy.
Well, say.
Well, investing in planning and thinking about the future has its own costs. It takes time and mental resources, which could be used for other things right now.
The trade-offs.
Exactly. Imagine early humans foraging for scarce berries. They have to balance the immediate need for food with the potential future need and the effort of planning for that future. Should I eat this now or save it? Should I look for more?
There's a trade-off, then, between the immediate benefits of acting on instinct and the potential long-term benefits of careful planning.
Definitely. Now, contrast this with the advantages of highly refined automatic actions, which become possible in more advanced societies through extensive training and specific skill.
Like crafts or sports.
Exactly. Crafting tools, playing sports, mastering a musical instrument. These automated processes free up our conscious cognitive resources. You don't have to think about every little step.
This brings us to the connectionist dual process model, or CDM. How does this help us understand the basic mechanisms of how our brains exert control?
Okay, the CDM. It's often illustrated using the Stroop task.
The color word thing, where the word BLUE is printed in red ink.
That's the one. The CDM shows how a system can learn the demands of a task, like name the ink color, and then use that knowledge to influence processing pathways without needing a central homunculus directing everything.
So it learns the rule.
It learns the rule, and that task demand representation then strengthens the brain pathway for color naming, allowing it to compete more effectively with the stronger, more automatic pathway for reading the word.
So it's a fundamental model showing how our brains can prioritize certain types of information processing based on the specific task we're trying to accomplish.
Exactly. While CDM is a simplified representation of the real brain, of course, it gives us important insights into the fact that our behaviors aren't strictly either controlled or automatic.
Right, it's more of a spectrum.
Instead, there's a whole spectrum of automaticity.
And how does this CDM idea relate back to those puzzling patient cases we talked about earlier?
Right.
Like the person who got into the wrong bed.
Well, that situation can be viewed as a conflict between a very strong automatic pathway, seeing a made bed activates a well-learned sequence of getting into bed,
Habitual response.
and a weaker, more context-appropriate pathway, recognizing you're in a stranger's house and that behavior is inappropriate. In that unusual context, the environmental cue, the made bed, was just so potent.
It won out.
It won out. It triggered the automatic response, and the weaker contextual information wasn't strong enough to override it.
So in that specific situation, the more deeply ingrained automatic response essentially won out over the more reasoned, context-aware response.
Seems likely. Now let's talk about the specific brain networks that are heavily involved in cognitive control, particularly the frontoparietal network.
Okay, the frontoparietal network.
Damage to this network can impair complex reasoning and problem-solving abilities even when someone's language skills remain intact.
So it's key for higher-level thinking.
Absolutely. This network is crucial for adapting to new rules and holding task-relevant information in mind. Think of this as a key communication highway in your brain for complex thinking.
But it's not just one single control center in the brain, is it? Like a CPU.
No, that's right. It's not a monolithic CPU. The frontoparietal network itself is made up of distinct subnetworks, such as the lateral frontoparietal network and the cingulo-opercular network.
So there's specialization within it.
Exactly. This suggests a more specialized and nuanced organization rather than one single control unit.
And considering that our working memory, the mental workspace where we hold and manipulate information, has a limited capacity, right? Typically around 3 or 4 items.
Yeah, it's surprisingly small.
How do we manage the sheer complexity of the real world with its many potential tasks and ever-changing contexts?
Good question. This limitation necessitates a system for controlling what gets into and what stays in our working memory. This process is known as gating.
Gating, like a gatekeeper.
Exactly. Imagine working memory as a guarded vault. An input gate controls what information is allowed to enter and be stored, providing stability and protecting against distractions.
Keeping the noise out.
It's like your brain's spam filter, letting in important emails and blocking out the junk.
That makes perfect sense. You wouldn't want every random thought or sensory detail cluttering up your limited mental workspace.
Exactly. An input gating policy allows us to filter out irrelevant information early on. Research has shown that people perform better on tasks when they can effectively use input gating to focus only on what's important from the start.
And what happens when the relevant information doesn't become clear until later in a sequence? Like you don't know what to focus on yet.
That's where output gating comes into play.
Right.
This is a strategy we use when we need to hold multiple pieces of information in mind until we know which one is relevant for our response.
So you hold it all, then select later.
Kind of, yeah. Interestingly, people tend to develop preferred ways of managing this flow of information in working memory, and they may stick with a learned gating policy even if a different one would be more efficient in a new situation.
So our brains can develop habits for how they manage the flow of information in our mental workspace. We get stuck in our ways.
Sometimes. Now, the basal ganglia, those structures deep within the brain involved in movement control.
Yeah, movement.
They also play a critical role in gating, but in this case, gating movements. There's a complex circuit involving the premotor cortex, the thalamus, and various nuclei within the basal ganglia.
It sounds like a rather intricate wiring diagram. Very complex down there.
It is complex, but in simplified terms, we can think of it as having go and no-go pathways.
Go and no-go.
Okay. When the go cells fire, they make a movement more likely by essentially releasing a brake on the thalamus, which then signals to the motor cortex. Go means go.
Makes sense.
Conversely, when no-go cells fire, they increase that braking action, making it harder for the go signal to initiate movement. No-go means stop.
So it's like a voting system for our actions. Go versus no-go.
That's a good way to think about it. The balance of activity between these go and no-go pathways determines whether or not a particular movement is executed.
Okay.
And the idea is that output gating of a memory, like a rule, a plan, or a goal, might work in a similar way through what's called the corticobasal ganglia loop.
So the same system for actions might gate thoughts.
That's the prevailing theory. The prefrontal cortex, which holds the current context, like the instructions for the Stroop task, sends signals to these go and no-go cells in the basal ganglia.
Okay.
If the go signal wins out, the thalamus is disinhibited, and it then sends that context information to other brain areas, influencing our responses, for example, strengthening the color naming response in the Stroop task.
So the same fundamental gating mechanism used for controlling our physical movements might also be adapted for selecting and applying information that we're holding in our working memory.
Fascinating.
It is fascinating,
Yeah.
but there are several points where this gating system could potentially fail.
Like where?
Well, if we don't update the context correctly, if we lose the relevant information from working memory, or if the timing of the output gating is off. Furthermore, inhibition, the action of those no-go cells in stopping impulsive responses, and our overall motivation also play significant roles in how well this system works.
Lots of places it can break down.
Many potential points of failure. So the current understanding, the prevailing thesis, is that cognitive control is fundamentally about how our brains translate our internal understanding of the world into effective strategies or policies for managing what gets into and what gets used from our working memory, basically, gating working memory.
Okay, so gating is key. Now let's consider the hierarchical nature of our goals. Things aren't usually just one step. Almost never. Think about a seemingly simple desire, like wanting a cup of coffee. That's a fairly abstract goal. But to achieve it, you need to perform a series of more specific sub-goals.
Like,
Perhaps queuing up, placing your order, paying. And these sub-goals often need to be carried out in a partly structured sequence. It's like a mental to-do list where some items depend on others.
it's a bit like breaking down a big project into smaller, manageable steps.
Yeah.
A hierarchy.
Exactly. Contrast this with older ideas in psychology, like behaviorist theories that viewed our sequences of actions as simple chains of reflexes.
Right, like dominoes falling.
Yeah, each triggered by the sensory feedback from the previous action. For example, the feeling of grinding coffee might trigger the next action of putting it in the filter.
The idea being that it's all just a series of automatic responses chained together by sensory input. Very simple.
Too simple, perhaps. While there's certainly some element of this chaining in our behavior, it doesn't fully explain our ability to pursue abstract goals and the flexibility we see in our actions.
And we make mistakes.
We make mistakes. We often make errors in sequential tasks. We might skip a step, repeat one, reverse the order, or even insert actions from a completely different task. Think about typos. You often don't immediately stop typing when you make a mistake.
No, you keep going for a bit usually.
And then you have those capture errors,
I'll capture errors.
where a more frequent or more automatic sequence of actions suddenly takes over from a less frequent one, like when you start making coffee even though you intended to make tea, your hand just goes for the coffee jar.
The force of habit takes over.
Pretty much. While these might seem like simple examples of well-worn habits taking over, a neural network model developed by Botvinnik and Plout showed that these kinds of sequential errors can arise from the underlying associative connections in the brain without needing a separate high-level representation of the entire task.
So the connections themselves can cause errors.
Yes, and importantly, the sub-goals themselves contain abstract information about the overall task.
So even at the level of these smaller individual actions, there's still a connection back to the overarching goal we're trying to achieve. It's not completely isolated.
Exactly. This idea of hierarchical cognitive control also applies to how we follow rules. Take the Stroop task again.
Okay, back to Stroop.
The conflict between reading the word and naming the color requires an abstract representation of the current task demand, name the color, to guide our responses and resolve that conflict. That's a level above just seeing the stimulus.
And we can create even more complex sets of hierarchical rules, right, to deal with situations where simple rules clash.
Absolutely. Like in that example where you have to press buttons based on both the color and shape of an object. Let's say red means press right, blue means left. But also square means left, triangle means right. What do you do with a blue triangle?
Conflict.
Conflict. But you can introduce a higher level rule, like if the object is small, pay attention to the color. If it's large, pay attention to the shape.
Master rule.
A master rule, exactly. You can visualize it like a decision tree. These hierarchical structures, while they can put more demands on our working memory and might sometimes lead to slightly slower reaction times.
Because there's more to keep track of.
Right. But they offer significant advantages in terms of efficiency and flexibility. Research has shown that people can implicitly learn and use these hierarchical rules.
Without even realizing it.
Often without realizing the structure, yes. And it leads to much faster learning and better overall performance compared to situations where there's no underlying hierarchical structure. It's like our brains are naturally good at finding and leveraging these nested levels of organization.
It's as if our brains are wired to look for these kinds of organizational patterns to make complex tasks more manageable. It's efficient.
It's very efficient. However, if our brains simply tried to represent every possible combination of contexts and rules for hierarchical control, a sort of flat representation,
That would be huge.
it would explode. It would quickly become overwhelming, what we call the scaling problem. We need models of control that can effectively capture and utilize this hierarchical structure without becoming impossibly complex.
And our understanding of how the prefrontal cortex supports this hierarchical control has advanced quite a bit, hasn't it? It's not just front-to-back simple progression.
No, it's more nuanced now. While there is a general trend of more abstract contexts being represented in the more rostral or forward parts of the prefrontal cortex, which then influence more specific rules and actions in the more caudal or rear regions.
Okay, abstract at the front, concrete at the back, roughly.
Roughly. But it's not a single continuous gradient of abstraction. It's a more intricate and interconnected organization involving different areas, specializing in different levels or types of context.
So it's a more nuanced picture than just a simple linear hierarchy within the prefrontal cortex, more like interacting networks.
Exactly. And one likely anatomical feature that supports this hierarchical gating is that the more rostral prefrontal cortex, which maintains these higher level, more abstract contexts,
Yeah.
it seems to send stronger signals to the caudal parts of the striatum, a key part of the basal ganglia involved in gating, than the other way around.
Oh, interesting. So the top influences the bottom more strongly.
It seems so. This allows those more abstract contexts to have a stronger influence on the lower level rules and actions. It's as if the overall strategic goals set the stage for the more detailed tactical maneuvers.
Okay, that makes sense structurally.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the seemingly modern challenge of multitasking.
Ah, yes. The bane of modern existence for many.
The general wisdom seems to be that trying to do too many things at once is a recipe for inefficiency, right?
That's certainly the prevailing view, and for good reason, based on the research. However, it's interesting to consider examples like Eugene O'Neill, the playwright.
What'd you do?
He famously worked on multiple plays simultaneously, but his unique workspace, Tao House, had separate buildings, or at least very distinct areas, dedicated to different plays.
Really?
Right.
Separate buildings.
So the suggestion is this physical setup might have played a crucial role. By physically separating his tasks, he essentially outsourced the job of task separation to his environment, reducing the demands on his internal cognitive control.
That's a clever strategy, using the physical space to help manage the mental demands of juggling multiple projects, minimizing interference.
Exactly, because when we try to perform multiple tasks within the same environment, we're constantly bombarded with cues that can trigger thoughts and actions related to other tasks. You see the report you need to finish while you're on a call.
Right, instant distraction.
This puts a greater strain on our internal control systems to keep those tasks separate and avoid interference.
And the evidence really does point to the costs of multitasking, doesn't it? You read about it everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. We see things like students taking longer to study and getting lower grades when they're multitasking during class or homework.
Which they do all the time.
Constantly, reduced productivity in the workplace, and even measurable time costs for things like interrupted phone users on Android devices. They take longer to get back to what they were doing.
And if those little interruptions add up.
Absolutely. The cumulative time lost to the cognitive overhead of constantly switching between tasks is likely quite significant across a day or week.
Wow. So is multitasking ability just something you're good or bad at?
It's complicated. While some people might have a generally higher capacity for multitasking than others due to individual differences in cognitive control, the ability to multitask effectively also tends to be very situation-specific.
Gaining.
You might be good at multitasking while cooking, for example, juggling multiple pans and timers, but struggle to do it effectively in other contexts, like writing an email while listening to a meeting. And no single aspect of cognitive control seems to be solely responsible for multitasking ability.
So it's a complex interplay of different cognitive skills and the specific demands of the tasks themselves, not just one multitasking skill.
Seems not. One of the main reasons we struggle with multitasking is that our brain's capacity for processing information in parallel is limited by processing bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks, like traffic jams in the brain.
Kind of, yeah. These bottlenecks aren't just a single point in the brain, but can occur at various stages of processing, from perceiving information to selecting a response and executing a movement.
And these bottlenecks are why we can't truly do two demanding things at the exact same time without some kind of performance trade-off. Something has to wait.
Pretty much. The bias competition model suggests that while our brains process a lot of information simultaneously, our attention system acts to bias the competition among these parallel processes, favoring the information relevant to our current goal.
Attention guides the resources.
Right. Bottlenecks tend to occur when the processing demands of multiple tasks overlap on shared brain resources, particularly within those frontoparietal control networks we discussed earlier. They're a common bottleneck.
Okay.
The psychological refractory period, or PRP effect.
TRP.
Yeah, it's a classic finding. It shows a slowdown in the response to a second task when it's presented very soon after a first task. That provides good evidence for these bottlenecks. Your brain is still busy with task 1 when task 2 arrives.
So there's a built-in delay in our processing when we try to handle too many things at once. You can't just instantly switch focus without cost.
Not instantly, no. Interestingly, research by René Marois and others using fMRI has pinpointed these frontal cognitive control networks as a key bottleneck during multitasking. And other work by Garner and Dux has also shown that with specific training in dual-task situations,
You can get better.
you can adapt. Your brain can develop more distinct neural representations for the individual tasks within the frontal cortex. This reduces the overlap in processing and lessens the reliance on common, abstract control mechanisms.
It's as if the brain learns to keep the neural pathways for different tasks more segregated with practice, like creating separate lanes on the highway.
That's a nice analogy. Now, even when we're not doing two things simultaneously, but rather switching rapidly between them, we experience a task switch cost.
Right, that moment of sluggishness when
Yeah.
you change tasks.
Exactly. A drop in performance immediately after switching. Early research by Gersold suggested that this cost isn't just the act of switching itself, but rather arises from the need to reconfigure our mental set.
Mental set.
The specific pattern of neural connections that are activated and tuned for each task. When two tasks have more overlapping mental sets, the switch cost tends to be higher because more reconfiguration is needed. If the tasks are very different using separate mental sets, the switch cost is lower.
Again, it seems like those lingering activations from a previous task can interfere with our ability to fully engage with the current one, like mental inertia.
Exactly. And this reinforces the idea that things like environmental cues, like O'Neill's separate rooms, and even just changing your physical location can influence your ability to focus and reduce that interference.
So maybe getting up and walking around before switching tasks could actually help.
It might. Our brains are dynamic systems, and the echoes of recently performed tasks can persist and interfere with the task at hand. This requires our working memory to actively maintain the representation of the current task and our output gating mechanisms to prioritize the correct responses over the lingering ones.
So it comes back to working memory and gating again.
It often does. Ultimately, both the costs of doing two things at once, dual tasking, and the costs of rapidly switching between them, task switching, seem to stem from competition for shared processing resources, particularly in our response pathways. When multitasking, one task often has to wait its turn. When task switching, we still face interference from the task we just finished.
Okay, let's move on to the critical ability to stop ourselves, that internal braking system we have. Inhibition.
Yes, inhibition. The capacity to deliberately suppress our thoughts and actions is absolutely central to cognitive control. It's about counteracting those impulsive tendencies.
Putting the brakes on.
Putting the brakes on. Now, while not every instance of stopping is necessarily an active inhibitory process, sometimes you just choose something else. There's compelling evidence that our brains do employ specific inhibitory mechanisms that are vital for effective control.
So it's an active process, not just passive.
In many cases, yes. Even William James, back in the late 19th century, viewed inhibition as a process of acquired habits suppressing our more instinctive tendencies.
It's about our learned ability to override those more automatic or impulsive urges, like telling yourself, don't eat that cookie.
Exactly. For something to truly qualify as inhibitory control in the brain, we need a specific mechanism that actively suppresses ongoing neural activity in a goal-directed way, rather than just selecting an alternative action.
A real stop signal.
Yes. And the no-go pathway within the striatum, part of the basal ganglia we mentioned.
Back to go and no-go.
Back to go and no-go. The no-go pathway appears to be one such true inhibitory system. When activated, it deepens the inhibition of the thalamus, effectively restraining the amplification of pending responses or currently active thoughts and plans. It's actively suppressing, unlike the go pathway, which promotes or selects action.
So it's a dedicated braking system in the brain, actively working to prevent us from acting or thinking in certain ways.
That's the idea. And the stop signal task is a clever experimental paradigm that allows us to precisely measure this inhibitory control.
How does that work?
In this task, participants are instructed to make a quick go response, usually pressing a button, but occasionally, maybe on 25% of trials, a stop signal appears shortly after the go signal.
Like a beep or a flash?
Exactly. And they have to try to cancel that already initiated go response, don't press the button.
Sounds tricky.
It can be. The horse race model helps us understand what's happening. The go process and the stop process are racing against each other. Successful stopping occurs when the stop process finishes before the go process reaches the point of triggering the motor response.
So if the stop signal comes early enough, you can stop. If it comes too late, you can't.
Basically, yes. And the stop signal reaction time, or SSRT, is a key measure we get from this task.
SSRT. Okay.
It tells us how quickly someone can inhibit a response, on average. It's calculated as the average go reaction time minus the duration of the stop signal delay, where people succeed about 50% of the time. It's considered an estimate of the strength of someone's inhibitory control.
Assuming the go and stop are separate races?
Assuming they're largely independent, yes. Interestingly, brain imaging evidence supports the existence of a distinct pathway involving the cortex and basal ganglia that is specifically engaged for this rapid stopping.
So there's a dedicated stop pathway.
Seems so. And TMS studies using magnetic stimulation have even shown that during successful stopping, there's a global inhibition of the motor cortex.
Global, meaning widespread.
Yes, not just in the specific area controlling the intended movement, but even in unrelated motor areas, like the muscles controlling the other hand. This suggests a widespread inhibitory signal being sent out when you successfully stop.
So it's not just about stopping that one specific action, but a more general dampening of motor activity across the brain, like hitting the brakes hard.
Kind of like a system-wide pause signal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, shifting from actions to thoughts, the Think-O-Think task provides a way to study inhibitory control over our thoughts and memories.
Inhibiting memories. How do you test that?
Participants first learn pairs of words, like ordeal roach, Then, in a later phase, they see the first word, ordeal, and are cued either to actively think about the paired word, roach, or to try their best to suppress its retrieval. Don't think about roach.
And can people actually do that? Suppress a memory?
Well, what researchers typically find is that memory for the no-think word pairs is worse later on compared to the think pairs or baseline pairs. This suggests that participants are indeed able, to some extent, to actively suppress the retrieval of those memories.
Interesting. And does this use the same brain machinery as stopping actions?
That's the intriguing part. Research using this think-no-think task, particularly by Michael Anderson and colleagues, has found some interesting overlap in the brain networks involved in suppressing memories and those involved in quickly stopping motor actions, particularly in the prefrontal cortex.
So maybe the same control system is being used.
It suggests that our global stopping system might also be engaged when we're trying to inhibit a thought or a memory. However, there are some differences observed. For example, activity in the subthalamic nucleus, another part of the basal ganglia involved in stopping movement, is less consistently found during memory suppression studies compared to motor stopping.
Ah, so maybe not identical.
Right. It cautions us against assuming the mechanisms are completely identical. There might be similarities, but also specialized processes.
So while there are similarities, there might also be some specialized processes involved in inhibiting thoughts versus actions. Makes sense.
And inhibitory control has significant implications for real-world behaviors, as you might imagine.
Like impulsivity.
Exactly. For instance, individuals struggling with addiction often show slower stop signal reaction times weaker inhibitory control. And intriguingly, this can sometimes even be observed in their close relatives who don't have addiction issues.
Suggesting a potential genetic link or vulnerability.
It suggests a potential underlying trait vulnerability related to inhibitory control. Effective stopping systems may act as an important brake against impulsive behaviors, protecting us from acting on every urge.
But it's not always about weak brakes, is it? Sometimes the go signal is just really strong.
That's a crucial point. Consider individuals who are highly sensitive to rewards. They might choose high-value actions even if those actions carry significant risks or negative consequences, not necessarily because they have weak inhibitory control, but because their drive towards the potential reward is very, very strong. The go pathway is just highly activated by the potential reward.
So it's a complex interaction between our ability to stop ourselves, no go, and our motivation to pursue desired outcomes, go, influenced by value.
Absolutely. Ultimately, inhibition involves actively exerting influence over both our actions and our thoughts, likely through multiple interacting mechanisms. And it's clear that factors like the perceived value and our underlying motivations play a crucial role in whether our attempts at inhibition succeed or fail.
This naturally leads us to consider the role of motivation more broadly, the costs and benefits that influence our cognitive control efforts. Why do we bother?
Exactly. The case of Elsie Nix is really powerful here. She suffered from akinetic mutism.
Akinetic mutism.
A profound lack of motivation to move or initiate action due to a brain cyst affecting the medial prefrontal cortex, especially the anterior cingulate cortex.
Wow, so she just didn't act.
Pretty much. But her remarkable recovery after the cyst was surgically removed really underscores how critical motivation is for getting things done. Having the brain mechanisms for selecting actions isn't enough. We also need the internal drive, the motivation to actually use them.
It's a stark reminder that we need the want to act, not just the how.
Precisely. It really highlights that many times when we struggle to get things done, it might not be a problem with our cognitive abilities themselves, our competency, but rather a lack of sufficient desire or incentive. Motivation is key.
So maybe procrastination isn't always laziness, it's a motivation calculation.
Could be. Motivation essentially has two sides. The value we expect to gain from a task or its outcome, the prize, and the mental and physical work required to complete it, which we often experience as aversive mental effort. That's the cost.
So our brains are constantly weighing the potential rewards against the perceived effort. A cost-benefit analysis.
A constant cost-benefit analysis happening under the surface. In decision-making theory, we talk about a value function, which describes the relationship between different situations and how desirable we find them.
How much we value something.
Right. And it's important to remember that this sense of value is highly subjective. Kahneman and Tversky famously showed this with money. The subjective value isn't linear.
Right. Losing $100 feels worse than gaining $100 feels good.
Exactly. And research has consistently shown that when we're offered incentives, our cognitive control performance improves across a wide range of lab tasks. Stroop, stop signal, task switching.
We try harder when there's a reward.
We do. It indicates that we're willing to exert more mental effort when we really want something. Motivation boosts control.
That certainly aligns with our everyday experiences. We're more likely to focus and persevere when the stakes are high or the reward is enticing.
And the neurochemistry fits too. Midbrain dopamine neurons, which play a critical role in reward processing.
Dopamine, the reward chemical.
Well, it's more complicated, but it's key. They signal what are known as reward prediction errors, the difference between the reward we expected and the reward we actually received.
Prediction errors.
Yeah. Unexpected rewards cause these neurons to fire strongly. Expected rewards lead to little change in firing. And missed rewards, or rewards less than expected, cause a dip in their activity. They signal surprise, basically.
Right.
And over time, as we learn associations, this reward-related firing shifts from the reward itself to the cues that predict the reward, like Pavlov's dogs hearing the bell.
The anticipation becomes rewarding.
Yeah.
And how does dopamine relate to that gating mechanism we discussed earlier, the go-no-go system?
Great question. Increased levels of dopamine in the striatum tend to create a go bias.
Go bias.
Meaning that less evidence is needed to open the gate and initiate an action. It lowers the threshold for go. Conversely, lower dopamine levels create a no-go bias, making it less likely for an action to be triggered, increasing the threshold.
So dopamine tunes the go-no-go balance based on reward expectation.
It seems to play a crucial role in regulating the threshold for action based on our expectations of reward. More expected reward, more likely to go.
It's like dopamine is adjusting the go signal strength in our brain's decision-making process based on potential payout.
That's a reasonable way to think about it. Now, about the cost side mental effort. Informal studies of workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk by Panos Iporotis, for example.
MTurk, right, the online task platform.
Yes. Those studies noted that workers often prefer and are willing to accept lower pay for simpler tasks that involve fewer and less complex steps.
Even if they could earn more per hour on complex tasks.
Sometimes, yes. Suggesting they're factoring in the mental effort involved as a cost. Larger-scale studies looking at real-world wages have also found that simpler mental tasks tend to be associated with lower pay compared to more open-ended and complex ones, which aligns with the Turkers' preferences.
It seems we have an intuitive understanding of the cost of mental effort and try to minimize it when possible. We avoid hard thinking if we can.
We often do. The concept of mental fatigue itself has been a subject of much debate, though.
Feeling mentally drained.
Exactly. While we all experience subjective feelings of being mentally tired, studies like Suruko Arai's famous experiment back in the early 20th century, she did complex math problems for 12 hours a day.
12 hours, wow.
Incredible. She found that while she reported feeling mental nausea, there wasn't a strong link between her subjective ratings of fatigue and actual changes in her performance. Her speed and accuracy didn't drop that much.
So she felt awful but could still do the math.
Pretty much. This led some researchers, like Thorndike, to argue against the idea of a limited, depletable mental resource, suggesting motivation is separate from efficacy. However, Arai's study was a single-person experiment on a highly unusual, motivated individual. So, maybe not generalizable.
Right. So while we might feel mentally fatigued, it doesn't necessarily mean our cognitive abilities are completely tapped out. It might be more about motivation flagging.
Could be. There's also a bit of a circularity problem in defining mental effort. We tend to avoid tasks we perceive as effortful, and we know they're effortful because we avoid them.
Right. How do you break that circle?
Well, Kurzboon offers an interesting hypothesis. He suggests that effort costs deter us from tasks that tie up our mental resources, preventing us from engaging in other potentially rewarding activities. The feeling of mental effort, in this view, signals the problem of simultaneity, or inherent limitations in multitasking.
So mental effort feels aversive because it represents the potential rewards we're missing out on by focusing on this one demanding task, the opportunity cost.
Exactly. This relates directly to the economic concept of opportunity cost. When we choose to focus our resources, our mental effort on one thing, we forego the potential gains from other things. This opportunity cost is experienced as that unpleasant feeling of mental effort.
That's a really interesting perspective. Effort as the feeling of missed opportunities.
It is. And interestingly, our spontaneous thoughts, our mind wandering, often revolves around unfinished tasks. that nagging
Well,
feeling.
the mental to-do list.
That activity is linked to brain regions important for thinking about the future, the same ones involved in episodic future thought. These thoughts about unmet goals are often negative and can be seen as that mental to-do list, causing anxiety and contributing to mental load.
So even when we're not actively working on a task, the fact that it's unfinished can continue to occupy our mental resources and feel effortful in a way.
Exactly. Now, thinking back to models like CDM, while earlier models like TOTI included mechanisms for online adjustment,
The testing steps.
right, the initial version of the connectionist dual process model lacked this kind of internal control over its own processing. It just responded based on learned associations.
Okay.
But Matt Botvinnik and Jonathan Cohen later added a conflict monitoring node to CDM. This node becomes active when the system detects conflict.
Like in the Stroop task.
Exactly. When a stimulus activates multiple competing responses, the more conflict detected, the more the system signals the need to engage contextual control to resolve it, like turning up the name, the color signal.
And the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, seems to play a key role in this conflict monitoring, right?
Yeah.
And perhaps in our subjective experience of effort.
That's a key idea. We see evidence for this in patients like RMB who had damage that included the ACC.
What happened with him?
While RMB showed normal behavioral adaptations to conflict in the Stroop task, his performance adjusted appropriately. He slowed down on hard trials.
So he could do it.
He could do it, but he lacked the subjective feeling of effort. He couldn't tell when the trials were harder, and he didn't show the typical emotional response measured by skin conductance associated with increased effort.
Wow. So the effort system adjusted, but he didn't feel it.
Exactly. It supports the idea that the feeling of effort is a distinct experience from the actual cognitive efficacy or adjustment.
So we can still adjust our behavior in response to cognitive demands, even if we don't consciously perceive that adjustment as being effortful. That's fascinating.
It is. This leads to theories like Shenhav, Botvinnik, and Cohen's expected value of control theory. They suggest that we decide to engage cognitive control when the expected benefits of doing so outweigh the anticipated costs, including effort.
Back to cost benefit.
Back to cost benefit. And they propose that the anterior cingulate cortex may be crucially involved in this ongoing cost-benefit analysis, evaluating whether exerting control is worth it.
Makes sense.
Ultimately, motivation, our expectations of valuable outcomes balanced against the costs of effort, is a primary driver of our cognitive control systems. And failures of control may often stem from insufficient motivation, from the cost-benefit calculation coming out negative, rather than simply limitations in our working memory or gating abilities.
Okay, now let's dive into the challenge of the information retrieval problem. How our brains manage to access the vast amounts of information we store. It's not like a computer file system, is it?
Not exactly. It's a fundamental challenge for any system that has a large database of information, whether it's our own memory, the internet, or a library. How do you efficiently find the specific piece of information you need that has a value greater than the cost of searching for it?
The value versus cost of searching.
Right. And this problem becomes exponentially harder as the size of the database grows. Think about your lifetime of memories.
It's like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a beach if you don't have a good search strategy.
Exactly. Think about trying to remember where you ate with a particular friend last month. The value of that memory depends on the task. If you're trying to recommend a restaurant, it's highly valuable. But searching for that specific memory also has costs. You might have to sift through numerous memories of that friend and various meals you've had. Effort again.
So our brains need effective strategies for prioritizing and accessing the most relevant memories. How do they do that?
Well, two key factors that strongly influence memory retrieval are recency memories that have been accessed recently are generally easier to retrieve again.
Use it or lose it, kind of.
In a way, and context memories that were encoded or retrieved in a particular setting are more likely to be accessed again in similar contexts. Think about a funny story you always tell at parties. The social setting itself acts as a retrieval cue.
It's like our memories are tagged with information about when and where they were last accessed or created.
That's a good analogy. We also engage in what's called controlled retrieval,
Controlled retrieval.
which is somewhat analogous to formulating a search query in Google. We generate retrieval plans using our existing knowledge to try and access more specific information.
Like narrowing the search.
Exactly. For example, if you're asked to make a cognitive estimation, like guessing the length of the human spine, well, most people don't know that offhand.
No idea.
So you'd likely start with more general knowledge, like average human height, maybe picture a spine, and then use inferences to arrive at an estimate. That's a retrieval plan.
Okay.
Deliberate mnemonic strategies, like the method of loci or mind palace, are also examples of controlled retrieval, where you mentally place items you want to remember in a familiar location and then walk through it to retrieve them.
Those memory tricks really highlight the active role we play in guiding our memory search. It's not just passive recall.
Not at all. Generating these knowledge structures and then navigating them to retrieve specific information requires cognitive control. Studies by Art Shimomura have shown that patients with damage to the frontal lobe often have difficulty applying organizational strategies when trying to learn and later retrieve information.
Like they can't make the plan.
Or can't execute it effectively. For example, when trying to remember a list of words by forming a story linking them together, they struggle with that strategy.
So those higher-level control functions, planning and strategy use, are important for structuring and then accessing our memories effectively.
Very important. We also constantly assess how effective our retrieval attempts are, and we can shift our strategies if one approach isn't working. We might try using different pieces of knowledge to probe our memory.
Like trying a different search term.
Exactly. And crucially, we make decisions about whether it's worth the mental effort to keep trying to retrieve a particular piece of information. That cost benefit, again.
It's a constant evaluation. Do I know this? Is it likely I can find it? Is it worth the effort to keep digging for it?
Precisely. We also have meta-memory.
Meta-memory.
Our knowledge about our own memory and our awareness of what we know and what we don't, how good our memory is likely to be for certain things. This meta-memory influences our retrieval efforts by providing cues derived from our existing knowledge. We weigh the likelihood of success against the perceived effort required based on how well we think we know something.
Like deciding if it's even worth trying to remember someone's name you met once briefly?
Exactly. Interference from other similar memories can also make retrieval difficult.
Oh yeah, getting memories mixed up.
Like trying to recall one specific song, maybe the Superman theme, but having another similar superhero theme constantly pop into your head. That imposter memory can confound the retrieval process. The wrong thing keeps coming up.
So sometimes our own memories can get in the way of each other. They compete.
They compete. To deal with this interference, we use post-retrieval control mechanisms.
Post-retrieval, after you've pulled something up.
Yes. These are processes that help us select the correct memory from among the competing ones that might be activated, much like how we need to support the color naming pathway in the Stroop task to overcome the more automatic word reading pathway. It's about resolving the conflict after retrieval brings up contenders.
Checking the retrieved item.
And evaluating it. We also routinely adjust our evaluation of retrieved memories based on the current situation. For example, you might recognize a face as familiar but not be able to recall where you met the person. That feeling of familiarity is retrieved, but post-retrieval control helps you evaluate that feeling. Is it just general familiarity or specific recognition relevant here?
So it's not just about pulling up a memory, but also about checking if it's the right one and if it fits the current context. Quality control.
Quality control is a good way to put it. Research by Sharon Thompson-Schill on verb generation, like saying drive when you see the word car, suggests that the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex plays a role in selecting the appropriate verb from a set of competing alternatives.
Like maybe wash or fix also come to mind.
Right. And this selection process is thought to be a post-retrieval control process. However, there's ongoing debate about the precise role of this brain region, whether it's primarily involved in controlled retrieval itself, post-retrieval selection, or maybe a combination of both.
It seems like the exact mechanisms, the division of labor, are still being actively investigated.
They are. It's complex. There's also an interesting idea about a potential balance or maybe even a homeostatic relationship between different memory control systems.
Oh, so?
Damage to the ventral controlled retrieval system associated with white matter pathways like the uncinate fasciculus that tend to degrade early in Alzheimer's disease might initially be compensated for by the post-retrieval control system. Like the quality control steps up when the initial search is weak.
Okay, one system picks up the slack.
Temporarily, perhaps, but as both systems gradually degrade over time, it might reach a tipping point leading to more significant and noticeable memory loss.
Interesting idea.
Finally, reward plays a role here too. Reward can prioritize memory encoding. Information associated with positive emotional states or rewarding outcomes is often more likely to be remembered later.
Makes sense. You remember the good stuff?
Usually. Some researchers, like Dillon and Pizzagalli, have proposed that disruptions in this internal prioritization system might contribute to the negativity bias in memories often observed in individuals with depression. They might preferentially encode or retrieve negative information.
Ah, so the value system affects memory directly.
It seems to. So ultimately, memory isn't just a passive storage system. It's an active search engine relying on multiple interacting control systems to plan retrieval, reduce interference, and evaluate the results. We assign value to our memories and use the knowledge we recover to constantly build and refine our understanding of the world.
Okay, finally, let's consider how these cognitive control abilities change across our lifespan, from childhood right through to old age. It's not static, is it?
Definitely not static. The development of cognitive control in childhood is a gradual and extended process, unfolding over many years rather than appearing suddenly.
Takes a long time.
A very long time. And it's really important not to view every instance of a child struggling with executive functions, you know, staying focused, controlling impulses as a deficit. It's often a normal part of their brain development.
So parents shouldn't panic if their kid is impulsive sometimes.
Exactly. When interventions are needed, they should be subtle and very different from how we'd address deficits in adult patients with brain injuries, for example. Giving children autonomy and allowing them to experience safe failures is crucial for them to learn self-control. Practice makes perfect, even for the brain's control systems.
So it's about nurturing these control systems through experience and learning, rather than trying to force them to develop faster or treating normal development like a disorder.
Precisely. Cognitive control emerges from a complex interplay of different brain regions and processes, not from a single control center suddenly switching on. Understanding cognitive control in children requires seeing it as a dynamic developmental journey.
And at the other end of the lifespan.
As we move into older age, we typically see a gradual decline in many aspects of cognitive control, while performance generally peaks in our 20s.
The cognitive peak.
Right. We often see a slow decline after age 30, which can become more noticeable in our 60s and 70s. This can lead to difficulties with everyday tasks like managing finances, navigating complex or noisy environments, or learning new technologies.
And this can unfortunately contribute to increased dependence.
It can. So the reasons for difficulties with control are quite different in children, where it's about ongoing development compared to older adults, where it's often related to age-related brain changes and some loss of function.
Different causes, similar surface behavior sometimes.
Sometimes, yes. However, it's also important to remember that the news about cognitive aging isn't all negative. Older adults often show preserved strength and resilience in certain cognitive domains, particularly those relying on accumulated knowledge and experience. It's not a uniform decline.
Okay.
It's interesting to look back at historical cases, like the 1936 case of patient A who exhibited quite childlike or puerile behavior after significant frontal lobe damage. It highlights how crucial the normal development and maintenance of these frontal lobe functions are for mature behavior.
That highlights how crucial the normal development of these frontal lobe functions is for mature behavior. Now, about that long development in kids, why does it take so long? Is the environment just messing things up?
Well, there's a common idea that the environment primarily plays a disruptive role, but if you think about it, a system with such a long and vulnerable developmental period would be unlikely to evolve if it were that easily derailed.
Good point. It needs to be robust.
So the alternative view is that this protracted development is actually necessary for optimization and customization. Our control systems need to be fine-tuned to the specific and unpredictable world we live in. The developing control system needs stable input from the rest of the brain perception, memory, motor systems to learn effective policies for guiding our thoughts and actions in our specific environment.
So it's a learning process that requires time and consistent input to fine-tune those control mechanisms for the world you live in.
Exactly. A classic example of early cognitive control development is the A not B error in infants.
Right, looking for the toy where it used to be.
Yes. Before around 12 months, if a toy is hidden in location A and the infant finds it, they'll often continue to look in location A even after seeing it hidden in a new location B. This can be seen as a failure of inhibitory control, a difficulty in updating their plan, or letting go of the previously rewarded action.
Perseveration again.
Kind of. Interestingly, changing the context during that critical trial, like changing the color of the cloth covering the location, can sometimes reduce this error. This suggests that the development of the ability to shift internal context to update the task set is a key aspect of control that emerges around 12 months.
Fascinating. When do we see the biggest leaps
We see the most significant improvements in most cognitive control measures between preschool age around 3–4 years and early adolescence around 10–12 years, with further refinement continuing throughout adolescence.
And things like rule following improve them.
Absolutely. Rule following and the ability to manage hierarchical rules also show a clear progression during this time. And just to clarify, when we talk about rule following in this developmental context, we're referring to their ability to follow arbitrary instructions in experimental tasks.
Not just whether they listen to their parents.
Exactly, though that might improve too, hopefully. So younger children's struggles with things like switching sorting rules in tasks like the Wisconsin card sorting test might reflect difficulties with that hierarchical control.
They can't manage the levels.
They might struggle to mentally separate the current task context, sort by shape now, from a previous one, sort by color, leading to competition between those different task contexts and resulting in errors. They haven't fully developed that flexible contextual control.
Okay. What about differences between people? We all know people who seem more or less organized or impulsive.
Yes, we see what's called the paradox of individual differences in cognitive control. While there seems to be a common underlying component to cognitive control, some people are just generally better at these tasks overall.
A general control factor.
Potentially. But individuals also show a wide range of different profiles across various specific measures. Someone might be great at inhibiting responses but struggle with working memory, or vice versa.
So it's not just one thing.
Doesn't seem to be. Twin studies suggest a significant genetic component, high heritability, for that common underlying control ability. But the more specific aspects of control, like performance on the stop signal task versus working memory updating, seem to be more influenced by unique environmental factors, the things siblings don't share.
So genetics sets a baseline, but experience shapes the specifics.
That's one interpretation. Issues with the purity of cognitive control tasks, the fact that they often tap into multiple underlying abilities, also contribute to the complexity of understanding heritability for specific tasks.
Right, the tests aren't perfectly measuring just one thing.
Rarely. This really emphasizes the importance, going back to kids, of them having diverse opportunities to encounter, grapple with, and independently solve new problems. This is how they develop those abstract and effective control policies tailored to their world.
So letting kids struggle a bit is good.
Within reason, yes. Caregivers should encourage this autonomy and allow for safe opportunities to make mistakes and learn from them. That's how self-control develops.
And as we age, what are the general trends we see in cognitive control abilities? You said decline, but is it everything?
Across most cognitive control tests, we do see a general decline in average function with age, although there's ongoing debate about which specific aspects are most vulnerable. Working memory capacity is often cited as a key area of decline.
Holding things in mind gets harder.
It often does. And this decline tends to be particularly noticeable in novel and unfamiliar situations when you can't rely on well-learned habits.
Which is why learning new tech can be tough sometimes.
Exactly. This has led to societal concerns given our increasingly aging population and the importance of maintaining cognitive control for independence and overall quality of life. There's a figure in the book, figure 9.4, showing the decline in the ability to perform independent activities of daily living across the lifespan. It really illustrates the real-world impact.
And this concern has fueled the popularity of brain training programs, hasn't it? The whole industry around it.
Oh, absolutely. The market for brain training is substantial, driven by demand from both aging adults hoping to maintain their cognitive function and parents wanting to boost their children's abilities.
That'll work.
Well, early enthusiasm for brain training was based on the plausible idea that it could enhance brain plasticity, that you could exercise your brain like a muscle.
Makes intuitive sense.
It does. However, early studies often had limitations, small sample sizes, maybe not enough cognitive tests to see broader effects. More rigorous research, including multiple large meta-analyses by people like Melby-Lervog and Holm and Schweihofer and colleagues.
What did they find?
They've provided a more nuanced picture. While these studies often find evidence for near transfer, meaning improvement on the specific tasks that were trained, or very similar ones, so you get better at the game you practice.
Okay, practice helps on the practice task.
Yes, but there's generally not strong, reliable evidence for far transfer.
Far transfer beats.
Significant and reliable improvement in broader, untrained cognitive abilities, like fluid intelligence, general working memory capacity, or everyday cognitive function. There's also evidence of publication bias, where studies showing positive effects are more likely to be published than those showing no effect.
So while you might get better at the specific brain training games you play, it doesn't necessarily translate to a general sharpening of your overall cognitive abilities or help much with real-world tasks.
That seems to be the consensus from the large meta-analyses currently. It's wise to be cautious about overly optimistic claims regarding brain training benefits. There's a risk of diminishing public faith in careful research if premature claims get debunked later.
But is there any hope?
Oh, I think so. As our understanding of the science of cognitive control continues to improve, there's still hope that more effective training programs, perhaps targeted more precisely, or maybe brain stimulation interventions, may be developed in the future. We're learning more all the time.
So what's the advice for now, especially for older adults?
Well, in the meantime, perhaps the best way to maintain sharp cognitive control as we age is likely to simply keep using it actively, particularly by engaging in new and challenging activities that provide reward and a sense of accomplishment.
Keep learning new things.
Exactly. Learning new skills like maybe digital photography or woodworking or a musical instrument or a language. These things can offer feasibility, independence, continued cognitive engagement, and importantly, reward in aging. Even if it doesn't magically improve your general multitasking ability, it keeps the control systems engaged and adapting.
So staying mentally active and continually learning new, engaging things seems to be the key, not just passively doing puzzles, maybe.
Active engagement seems crucial.
Okay, so wrapping up, let's think about how cognitive control relates to some of humanity's biggest challenges. You mentioned climate change earlier.
Yes. Our ability to understand the complexities of an issue like climate change, to envision potential future consequences, even distant ones, and to innovate and adapt solutions is fundamentally enabled by our sophisticated cognitive control systems. Planning, goal setting, inhibiting immediate gratification for long-term benefit. It all relies on this machinery.
We have the knowledge and the capacity to understand the risks, often in great detail, but there's still often that disconnect, that gap between knowledge and taking meaningful action on a large scale. Why?
Well, it comes back to motivation and that cost-benefit analysis. Motivating widespread behavior change requires people to see a positive trade-off between the perceived benefits of taking action and the costs of the effort involved.
The value has to outweigh the cost.
Right. And the enormous, but perhaps abstract or distant benefit of potentially avoiding catastrophic climate change might not be enough to drive individual action if people discount their own impact, what difference can I make, or perceive the recommended actions changing lifestyles, investing in new tech as too costly or difficult right now.
So the future benefit feels too uncertain or far away compared to the immediate cost or hassle.
That's often the calculation, implicitly or explicitly. So it's not just about making people aware of the severity of the problem, which cognitive control allows us to understand. It's also about fostering a belief in the efficacy of individual and collective actions and finding ways to make those actions feel less burdensome, more valuable, or more socially rewarding.
We need to frame the benefits and reduce the perceived costs.
Exactly. Ultimately, effective cognitive control involves having good policies for managing the information in our working memory, those metaphorical gates, achieving a balance between stability, staying focused, and flexibility, adapting, and crucially, structuring our goals and choices to maximize the potential benefits of our actions while minimizing the associated costs of effort and opportunity.
It's about getting the balance right, driven by our values and motivations.
Precisely. We hope this deep dive into the science of how our brains get things done has given you some valuable insights into your own control systems.
Absolutely. It's been a truly fascinating exploration of the intricate mechanisms that allow us to manage our thoughts and actions, bridge that gap between knowing and doing. We encourage you, the listener, to take some time to reflect on these concepts, gating, hierarchy, effort, motivation, and consider how cognitive control operates and sometimes fails in your own life. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.